every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The light on July 22, 2011, was the soft, gentle light of a Nordic summer. On the small, heart-shaped island of Utøya, nestled in the Tyrifjorden Lake, the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, of political debate, of teenagers enjoying the annual summer camp hosted by the youth wing of Norway's ruling Labour Party. They were the future of the nation's political left. Idealistic, engaged, and full of life, they talked of multiculturalism, of tolerance, of a progressive future. The day was idyllic, a perfect portrait of the peaceful, egalitarian society Norway had so carefully built. But in the nation's capital, Oslo, just 40 kilometers away, that peace was about to be shattered by an entirely different vision of the future. At 3:25 p.m., a thunderous explosion ripped through the heart of the city's government district. A van packed with nearly 1,000 kilograms of a fertilizer-based explosive detonated, tearing the face off the Prime Minister's office building and sending a shockwave that radiated for miles. Windows shattered. Streets were filled with smoke, debris, and the cries of the wounded. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. The initial assumption, shaped by a decade of global events, was an attack by international jihadists. But the true architect of the horror was Norwegian, and he was just getting started. The bombing was a diversion, a monstrous piece of theater designed to draw law enforcement to the city center, while he, disguised in a police uniform, made his way toward the isolated island of Utøya, toward the unsuspecting teenagers who represented everything he had come to despise. This is not simply the story of a massacre. It is a story about how a man can become an island unto himself, constructing an entire reality from hatred, resentment, and a grotesque sense of destiny. It is a story of meticulous planning, of years spent in quiet, obsessive preparation for a singular, cataclysmic act of violence. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a lone wolf terrorist. We will explore the radicalization of Anders Behring Breivik, the cold logic of his two-part attack, and the profound, unsettling questions his crimes forced upon Norway and the world about the line between political extremism and clinical madness. To understand the cataclysm of July 22nd, we must first attempt to understand the man who engineered it. Anders Behring Breivik was not born into a world of violence or overt extremism. He was a product of the very society he sought to destroy. Born in Oslo in 1979, his early life was marked by a quiet, insidious instability. His parents, a diplomat and a nurse, divorced when he was just 1 year old. His father, Jens Breivik, moved to Paris, and after a custody dispute, contact became sporadic and eventually ceased altogether. Anders was raised by his mother, Wenche Behring, in a middle-class apartment on Oslo's west side. Early childhood psychological reports, which would later be scrutinized with chilling hindsight, painted a troubling picture. A report from when he was just 4 years old described him as anxious, oppositional, and prone to bizarre smiles. It noted a strained, dysfunctional relationship with his mother, who at times reportedly felt overwhelmed and even repulsed by him. The psychologists recommended he be removed from her care, but this recommendation was never acted upon. Instead, he remained in a home environment that was, by many accounts, emotionally sterile. He grew into a solitary child who struggled to form deep connections with his peers. As a teenager, he found a fleeting sense of belonging in the burgeoning hip-hop and graffiti scene in Oslo. He adopted the tag morgue, and for a time was immersed in this subculture. But like many of his later endeavors, it was a persona he would eventually discard. He was caught by police for graffiti, and the shame of the incident seemed to be a turning point. He cut off his friends from that scene and began to cultivate a new image, one of a respectable, aspiring young conservative. He joined the youth wing of the Progress Party, a right-wing populist party in Norway. Here, he found an outlet for his budding political ideas, but he was never a prominent figure. He was seen as quiet, somewhat awkward, and his political contributions were largely unremarkable. Financially, his life was a series of ambitious but ultimately failed ventures. He tried his hand at various businesses, including one that involved selling fake university diplomas. For a time, he made a significant amount of money through stock market speculation, allowing him to cultivate an image of success. He wore expensive clothes, frequented exclusive clubs, and projected an air of self-made confidence. But it was a fragile facade. By his late 20s, his financial fortunes had waned, and he was forced to move back into his mother's apartment. For a man who craved status and recognition, this was a profound humiliation. He was approaching 30, living with his mother, with a string of failed careers behind him. He had failed to become the successful entrepreneur, the respected political figure, the man of influence he so desperately wanted to be. It was in this state of perceived personal failure that he retreated almost completely into the online world, and it was there that his ideology of hate began to crystallize. The Internet became Anders Breivik's university, his church, and his training ground. From the solitude of his bedroom in his mother's apartment, he plunged into the echo chamber of the Ferrite blogosphere. He spent thousands of hours consuming and contributing to anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic, and anti-feminist forums. He devoured the works of writers like Peter Nostvold Jensen, known as Fjordman, a Norwegian blogger who argued that European culture was under existential threat from Islam and multiculturalism. He absorbed conspiracy theories about cultural Marxism, the idea that a cabal of leftist elites was deliberately undermining Western civilization from within by promoting multiculturalism, feminism, and political correctness. This online world provided him with two crucial things he lacked in his real life: a grand narrative that explained his personal failures, and a sense of purpose. In this narrative, he was not a failure. He was a victim, a casualty of a corrupt system that celebrated weakness and punished traditional European values. The problems were not his own shortcomings, but the fault of feminists, Muslims, and the Labour Party government that enabled them. This ideology transformed his personal resentment into a righteous political crusade. It gave his isolation a new meaning. He was not a lonely man in his mother's apartment, but a clandestine soldier gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Over several years, he began to synthesize these disparate ideas into a single, sprawling document. It would become his life's work, a 1,518-page compendium titled 2083, A European Declaration of Independence. The title itself is revealing. 2083 marks the 400th anniversary of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Vienna in 1683, a key event in the mythology of the European Ferrite. The document was a pastiche of his own writings, plagiarized articles from other extremist bloggers, and even, bizarrely, excerpts from the manifesto of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. In it, he lays out his worldview in painstaking detail. He describes a continent on the brink of collapse, overrun by Muslim immigrants in a process he calls Eurabia. He calls for a violent, conservative revolution to overthrow the cultural Marxist regimes of Europe and deport all Muslims. The document is also a deeply personal text, a self-aggrandizing autobiography where he casts himself as a heroic figure, a justiciar knight commander in a resurrected order of the Knights Templar. He meticulously details his own radicalization, his workout routines, his steroid use, and his emotional state, presenting himself as a stoic, self-sacrificing warrior. This invented order, the Paupers Camilitones Christi Templiques Solomonici, or PCCTS, was a fantasy. While Breivik claimed to be part of a secret pan-European network, investigations after the attack found no evidence that any such organization existed. He was its only member. The Knights Templar was a construct, a historical brand he co-opted to give his solitary mission a veneer of historical grandeur and collective legitimacy. It allowed him to see his planned acts of terrorism not as murder, but as a military operation, an execution of traitors carried out by a legitimate soldier in a clandestine war. The manifesto was his justification, his legacy, and, most chillingly, his instruction manual. It concluded with detailed sections on acquiring weapons, building bombs, and planning attacks. On the morning of July 22, 2011, just hours before the bombing, he emailed this document to over 1,000 contacts across Europe. His war was about to begin. The plan was a testament to years of chillingly patient and methodical preparation. Breivik's transition from an online ideologue to a physical terrorist was not a sudden snap, but a slow, deliberate process of logistical planning and self-deception. He understood that to carry out an attack of the scale he envisioned, he would need resources, a plausible cover story, and an iron will. He began laying the groundwork as early as 2009, nearly 2 years before the attacks. His first major step was to create a legitimate front for his activities. He established a sole proprietorship, a farming company he named Breivik Geofarm. This was a stroke of strategic brilliance. By registering as a farmer, he gained access to a commodity that is common in agriculture, but is also a key ingredient in powerful explosives, fertilizer. In May of 2011, he used his company to legally purchase 6 metric tons of fertilizer containing ammonium nitrate. The purchase was large, but not so large as to automatically trigger alarms in a country with a significant agricultural sector. He had the core ingredient for his bomb. To acquire the rest of the components and a place to work undisturbed, he rented a remote farmhouse in the rural town of Amit. The isolation was perfect. Here, far from the prying eyes of neighbors, he could work on his bomb and conduct test detonations without raising suspicion. The farmhouse became his laboratory and his armory. He painstakingly gathered the other necessary chemicals, including aluminum powder and nitromethane, often buying small quantities from multiple vendors to avoid suspicion. He studied bomb-making manuals online, applying the same obsessive focus to chemistry and engineering that he had applied to his manifesto. Simultaneously, he began the process of arming himself for the second phase of his attack. He joined a local gun club, a necessary step to legally purchase firearms in Norway. Over months, he participated in training, projecting an image of a normal, responsible gun enthusiast. This allowed him to legally acquire a Glock 34 semi-automatic pistol and a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle. He also purchased specialty ammunition designed to inflict maximum internal damage. His choice of weapons was, like everything else, coldly practical. His disguise was another critical element. He knew that to gain access to Utøya Island, which was secured for the political camp, he would need an unimpeachable cover. He purchased a fake police uniform online, piece by piece, along with a counterfeit police ID. To an unsuspecting person, he would look like an officer from the National Police Force, an authority figure to be trusted and obeyed, especially in a moment of national crisis, a crisis he himself was about to create. Throughout this period, he maintained a strict, self-imposed discipline. He used steroids, not just for physical strength, but, as he wrote in his manifesto, to enhance his aggression and suppress his fear. He engaged in meditation and mental exercises to desensitize himself to the violence he was about to commit. He referred to this as embracing evil. To fight evil, he systematically severed his few remaining social ties, believing that emotional connections were a weakness. He was forging himself into a weapon, stripping away his own humanity to become a more effective instrument of his ideology. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an executioner, a surgeon cutting a cancer out of society. The farmhouse was not just a bomb factory. It was the crucible where Anders Breivik, the failed businessman, died, and the Justiciar Knight Commander was born. The afternoon of Friday, July 22nd began with a deceptive calm. Breivik, dressed in his false police uniform, loaded the completed bomb, a massive device weighing 950 kilograms, into a white Volkswagen Crafter van he had rented for the purpose. He had spent the last 2 days on a cocktail of stimulants to stay awake and focused. He was now operating on pure adrenaline and ideological fervor. He began the 2-hour drive from the remote farmhouse to the heart of Oslo, a journey into the abyss. At 3:17 p.m. he parked the van directly in front of H Block, the building that housed the office of Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg. He lit a 7-minute fuse, calmly walked away from the vehicle, and got into a second getaway car, a gray Fiat Doblo, that he had parked nearby. He began driving west, away from the city center, toward Utøya. He was listening to the radio, waiting. At 3:25 p.m., the bomb detonated. The force of the blast was immense, equivalent to about 500 kilograms of TNT. It killed 8 people, injured hundreds more, and turned the serene government quarter into a war zone of twisted metal, shattered glass, and rising smoke. The first part of his plan had been executed flawlessly. The nation's security apparatus was now focused entirely on downtown Oslo, searching for survivors and hunting for perpetrators, assuming, as he had predicted, that the threat was over, or that it originated from foreign terrorism. Meanwhile, Breivik was well on his way to the second and far more horrific target. He drove for about an hour and a half to the ferry landing at Tyrifjorden Lake. He arrived at approximately 4:50 p.m. There he approached the staff, running the ferry to Utøya Island. He was a convincing figure, tall, blonde, clad in the full uniform of the tactical police, armed and carrying a heavy crate of what he claimed was additional security equipment. He told the staff that he was being sent from Oslo as a routine precaution in the wake of the bombing, to brief the campers and secure the island. In the confusion and anxiety following the news from the capital, his story was plausible. No one questioned him. He was given passage on the MS Torbjorn ferry. On the short boat ride over, he stood with Monica Bose, the camp manager and one of the first people he had spoken to. Bose, known affectionately as Mother Utøya, was a comforting presence. She engaged him in conversation, trying to understand the situation. She was with an off-duty police officer who was acting as a security guard for the camp. As they docked, the officer became subtly suspicious of Breivik's story and his credentials. He and Bose walked with Breivik toward the main information building. It was there, at approximately 5:15 p.m., that Breivik raised his Glock pistol and shot them both dead. The massacre on Utøya had begun. For the next 72 minutes, the idyllic summer camp was transformed into a landscape of unimaginable terror. After killing his first 2 victims, Breivik began to move methodically across the small island, hunting the hundreds of teenagers and young adults trapped there. He used his police uniform to his advantage, at times calling out to his terrified victims, telling them he was a police officer and that they were safe, only to shoot them as they emerged from their hiding places. The sound of his gunshots echoed across the water, initially mistaken by some for firecrackers. The campers, most between the ages of 14 and 22, had been gathered to discuss the Oslo bombing when the attack on their own island began. Panic erupted. They scattered in every direction, seeking any available cover. They hid in tents, in buildings, under beds, in the dense foliage of the island's forest, and along the rocky shoreline. Some tried to play dead. Others made the desperate choice to jump into the cold lake waters and attempt the 600-meter swim to the mainland, all while Breivik fired at them from the shore. He moved with a chilling calm, a hunter stalking his prey. He used his rifle for long-range shots and his pistol for close-quarters executions, reloading multiple times. The victims' calls for help were desperate and heartbreaking. Using their mobile phones, they called their parents and emergency services, whispering their location, their voices trembling with fear. "Mom, there's a man shooting here. I love you." These calls flooded the emergency lines, but the authorities were overwhelmed and in a state of confusion. The reports from the island were chaotic and seemed unbelievable. Initial reports suggested only a handful of injuries. The police response was tragically and catastrophically delayed. The local police force was under-resourced. The elite Delta Force Tactical Unit, based in Oslo, was mobilized, but faced a series of disastrous logistical hurdles. There was no available police helicopter. They were forced to drive. When they arrived at the lake, the small rubber boat they had was overloaded with equipment and personnel, and its engine failed. They had to be rescued by civilian boaters who were already in the water, heroically trying to pull survivors to safety. All the while, Breivik continued his rampage unimpeded. He walked from the campsite to the pump house on the southern tip of the island, where many had fled. He executed them. He walked along the Lover's Path, a scenic trail by the water, and murdered those hiding among the rocks. He showed no emotion, no hesitation. This was the culmination of his life's work, the atrocious but necessary act he had described in his manifesto. Finally, at 6:27 p.m., more than an hour after the first shot was fired, the Delta Force team landed on the island. Breivik, his ammunition nearly spent, saw them approach. He dropped his weapons, raised his hands, and surrendered without a fight. His mission, in his mind, was complete. In 72 minutes, he had murdered 69 people on Utøya, the vast majority of them teenagers. Combined with the 8 killed in Oslo, his final death toll was 77. The peaceful nation of Norway had just experienced its deadliest day since World War II. In the immediate aftermath of Breivik's surrender, the full scale of the horror on Utøya began to reveal itself. The island, once a symbol of youthful idealism, was now a silent, sprawling crime scene. First responders were met with a scene of utter devastation, the bodies of victims scattered across the landscape, in buildings and along the shoreline. Mobile phones rang incessantly in the pockets of the deceased, as frantic parents tried desperately to reach their children. The process of identifying the victims and notifying their families was a monumental and heartbreaking task for the Norwegian authorities. Breivik himself was transported back to Oslo. During his initial interrogations, he was calm, cooperative, and lucid. He spoke at length about his motives, eager to explain the ideological framework behind his actions. He described the attacks, not as murder, but as a marketing operation for his manifesto. He claimed to be a commander in a secret organization called the Knights Templar, and insisted there were other cells ready to strike across Europe. This claim triggered a massive investigation, but authorities ultimately concluded that he had acted entirely alone. He was a terrorist army of one. The discovery of his 1,500-page manifesto, which he had emailed out just before the attacks, provided a terrifyingly clear window into his mind. It confirmed that this was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a premeditated act of political terrorism. Planned for years down to the smallest detail, it was a declaration of war against multiculturalism. And the victims on Utøya were not random. They were chosen. As members of the Labour Party youth, they represented, in Breivik's twisted worldview, the future generation of the political elites he blamed for betraying Norway to Islamic colonization. The attack was designed for maximum symbolic impact. To decapitate the future leadership of the party he held responsible for the nation's supposed decay. The investigation that followed was the largest in Norwegian history. Police meticulously pieced together his movements over the preceding years. The purchase of the farm, the acquisition of chemicals and weapons, the online trail of his radicalization. Every step had been taken in plain sight, using legal means, yet had gone unnoticed. It raised profound and uncomfortable questions for Norwegian society about how such a monster could have been cultivated within its own borders without anyone raising an alarm. The nation, renowned for its openness and trust, was forced to confront the reality that these very values may have been exploited by Breivik to facilitate his plot. As the country grieved, its response was remarkable. Rather than meeting hatred with hatred, political leaders and citizens alike called for more democracy, more openness, and more humanity. Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, whose own office had been bombed, delivered a now famous speech declaring, "Our response is more democracy, more openness, and more humanity, but never naivety." This sentiment guided the nation through the difficult months that followed, culminating in a legal process that would put not only Breivik on trial, but the very concept of sanity itself. The trial of Anders Behring Breivik, which began in April 2012, was always going to be more than a simple criminal proceeding. The facts of the case were not in dispute. Breivik proudly admitted to carrying out the bombing and the massacre. He pleaded not guilty, however, arguing that his actions were a necessity to defend Norway from the threat of multiculturalism. With his guilt established from his own confession, the central question of the trial became his state of mind. Was he a sane political terrorist or a delusional paranoid schizophrenic? The answer to this question would determine whether he would be sent to prison or to a secure psychiatric facility. It was a question that would polarize legal and psychiatric experts and captivate the world. The prosecution's initial stance was guided by a court-appointed psychiatric report submitted before the trial. This first assessment, conducted by 2 psychiatrists, concluded that Breivik was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. They found that he was psychotic during the attacks, and therefore criminally insane. They pointed to his belief in the Knights Templar organization and his grandiose self-perception as a savior of Europe as evidence of a delusional reality. If the court accepted this finding, Breivik could not be held legally responsible for his actions and would be committed to psychiatric care, potentially for the rest of his life. This conclusion sparked a massive public and professional backlash. To many, including survivors and the families of victims, declaring him insane felt like a denial of the political nature of his crime. It risked reframing his meticulously planned act of terrorism as the meaningless violence of a madman, thereby invalidating the ideological motivations he was so eager to espouse. Breivik himself was outraged by the diagnosis. His greatest fear was not a prison sentence, but being dismissed as insane. He saw it as an attempt to delegitimize his political message. He wanted to be seen as a sane, rational political soldier, not a psychiatric patient. Due to the immense public controversy, the court took the unusual step of commissioning a second independent psychiatric evaluation. This second team of experts observed Breivik for weeks and came to the opposite conclusion. They found no evidence of psychosis or schizophrenia. Instead, they diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. They argued that his extremist worldview, while abhorrent, was not delusional in a clinical sense. It was a coherent, albeit hateful, political ideology shared by others on the fringes of the far-right. His belief in the Knights Templar, they argued, was more of a grandiose, self-serving fantasy and a branding tool than a genuine psychotic delusion. He was, in their expert opinion, legally sane and therefore criminally responsible. The trial thus became a battle of the experts, with psychiatrists testifying for both sides. The prosecution was left in the bizarre position of having to argue for Breivik's insanity, a position their own initial report supported, but which felt increasingly untenable. Breivik was given the opportunity to testify for days on end. He entered the courtroom each day with a clenched fist salute, a gesture he described as a symbol of right-wing strength. He delivered a rambling, pre-prepared speech, calmly and lucidly explaining his ideology and the rationale behind his attacks. He expressed no remorse, stating he would do it all again. He described the teenagers on Utøya not as children, but as political activists who were legitimate targets in his war. His testimony was a chilling performance. He was articulate, methodical, and utterly devoid of empathy. His calm demeanor and the coherent, if horrifying, logic of his statements seemed to belie the diagnosis of schizophrenia. He presented himself as a rational actor, and in doing so, he made a powerful case for his own sanity. The survivors and families had to endure listening to the man who had destroyed their lives explain his actions in painstaking, remorseless detail. For them, the legal question of sanity was secondary. They wanted accountability. They wanted the court and the world to recognize that he knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. On August 24, 2012, the 5-judge panel delivered its unanimous verdict. They sided with the second psychiatric report, finding Anders Behring Breivik sane and criminally responsible for his actions. He was convicted of 77 counts of murder and of committing acts of terror. He was sentenced to the maximum penalty under Norwegian law, 21 years of preventive detention. This is a special type of sentence that can be extended indefinitely, for 5 years at a time, as long as the prisoner is deemed a threat to society. It effectively means he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars. Upon hearing the verdict, Breivik smiled. He had won. The court had validated his view of himself. He was a political terrorist, not a madman. His ideology had not been dismissed as a symptom of illness. It had been acknowledged, judged, and condemned. The case of Anders Behring Breivik forces us to look into a modern abyss. The anatomy of his crime is not found in a sudden psychotic break, but in the slow, meticulous construction of a worldview so hateful and narcissistic that it could justify mass murder. He represents a uniquely 21st century evolution of the terrorist, the lone wolf, self-radicalized in the echo chambers of the Internet, who meticulously plans and executes a sophisticated attack without the support of any larger organization. He was not an agent of a foreign power or a member of a sprawling network. He was a product of the very Western society he claimed to be saving. His sanity was the fulcrum upon which the entire legal process turned, and the court's decision to declare him sane was profound. It affirmed that a political ideology, no matter how extreme or vile, is not in itself a sign of madness. It established that one can be both a monster and a rational actor, capable of understanding the nature of their actions. To have declared him insane would have been, in a way, a comfort. It would have allowed society to place him in a category of otherness, a mentally ill aberration far removed from the political discourse of the mainstream. But the verdict of sanity forces a more uncomfortable reckoning. It means we must confront the fact that the ideas that motivated him exist on a continuum with political beliefs held by others. It means acknowledging that the journey from extremist rhetoric to extremist violence is not always a descent into psychosis, but can be a calculated, deliberate choice. Breivik's goal was to inspire a wave of similar attacks, to ignite a continent-wide civil war. In this, he failed. But his methods and his ideology have not disappeared. His manifesto remains online, a blueprint for other disaffected young men who feel alienated and left behind. He demonstrated how a single individual, armed with patience, a sense of profound grievance, and the vast resources of the Internet, can inflict catastrophic damage. The anatomy of this case is therefore the anatomy of a modern warning. A chilling portrait of how personal failure can curdle into ideological hatred, how online fantasy can manifest as real-world horror, and how the most dangerous threats may not be the armies we can see, but the lone crusaders we cannot. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.